Hi, you guys. So let's talk about the Constitutional Convention. Now, before we can get into the Constitutional Convention, we need to go back to the time under the Articles of Confederation. And remember, under the Articles of Confederation, that the national government doesn't have a lot of authority, and states, if they have issues, they really, technically they're allowed to help them, but they really don't have a way to help them. So, George Washington decides that he is going to invite delegates from Virginia and Maryland to his house to solve a problem. And his house is called Mount Vernon in 1785. And this meeting is so successful that James Madison, who I'm sure was there, he is like, we should do this again, but on a larger scale. And so he suggests to the Virginia General Assembly that they should do this in Annapolis, Maryland. And so they issue invitations, and 9 of the 13 states RSVP. The problem, though, is that only 5 of the states show up. And because they weren't able to get as much done as they would have liked, because there weren't as many people there, they decide that they're going to meet again in the following May, which is 1787. Now, when they meet in Philadelphia, they have no intention of coming up with a new constitution. They are planning to strengthen the Articles of Confederation. And remember that I am abbreviating the Articles of Confederation as the AOC. So remember that by the time of May 1787, there are some major issues going on. There's still a slight depression going on. There are people who are not able to make as much money, farmers who are losing their land, and Shays' Rebellion is still going on. And it has been proven that the Articles they have been ineffective on more than one occasion. And if you would like to learn more about that, you need to go back and look at previous slides in your notes, as well as watch the previous video on the Articles of Confederation. So, in Philadelphia, in May 1787, the delegates meet and they ultimately decide. Now, remember, they weren't planning on coming up with a new form of government, but once they get there, they decide that they need to come up with a new plan of government. And so in May 1787, the delegates meet from 12 states send people. Rhode Island is the only person who didn't send somebody. And for the next 4 months, they are creating our framework of government. Now, each state within the convention, each state has one vote. They decide that decisions will be made with a simple majority. And in order to make decisions freely and without bias or without outside influence, they decide that they're going to make the meetings private. That means that nobody from the public can come in and nobody from the press can come in. Only the delegates are allowed into the meeting. And so the delegates, there were about 55 of them, and they were actually a really pretty cool group of people. 1/3 of these men had served in the Continental Army. 8 of them had signed the Declaration of Independence. The youngest person was 26 years old, and the oldest person was Benjamin Franklin, and he was 81 years old. So you have people like Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, Roger Sherman. These people are going to be very important as we go on. And these people are called the framers. When we talk about the framers of the Constitution, we are talking about this group of men. Now, it's important to understand that James Madison was also present, and he is very influential because it was his plan in the first place that came up this with this convention, and he writes parts of the Constitution. Now, these are some of the people who were present. I've already mentioned Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, Roger Sherman, but we also have William Patterson. He proposes the New Jersey plan, and which we're going to talk about in a second, and Edmund Randolph, who proposes the Virginia plan, which we're going to talk about in just a second. So there were two plans of government, or two plans that suggested a way that they wanted to organize the government, and they were proposed by two states, Virginia and New Jersey. And these proposals would structure how representatives would be chosen. So the Virginia plan was written by James Madison, and it called for three branches of government with the power to check other branches. So that means that they had the power of checks and balances. And they called for a bicameral legislature with membership based on the state's population. The Virginia plan is often called the large state plan because Virginia was one of the largest states in the new country. And so they wanted as many people to represent them in Congress as possible. So the best way to do that was to do it by population. So the large states thought this was great. The smaller states, not so much. Um, Members in the lower house, so that would be the House of Representatives, would be chosen by the people, while the members in the Senate or the upper house would be chosen by the state legislatures, and they wanted a strong national government. So that's the Virginia plan. The other plan was the New Jersey plan, and this is often called the small state plan. Um, They called for a strong central government as well that was made up of three branches, just like the Virginia plan. But this is where they start to change. They believe that we should have a unicameral legislature. Now remember, the Virginia plan said two chambers. They wanted one chamber in the legislature, and they wanted each state to only have one vote. So New Jersey would have one vote, Virginia would have one vote, Georgia would have one vote, North and South Carolina would have one vote. So they wanted to have equal voting because they obviously don't have the same population that Virginia does. So they wanted a chance to have a equal voting. Ultimately, this plan was rejected by the delegates. And so Roger Sherman composes the Great Compromise that was presented in 1787, and it combines elements from both plans. And it calls for a bicameral legislature. Remember, bicameral means two houses. Membership in the House would be in the House of Representatives, and I will be abbreviating the House of Representatives as HOR from now on, by the way. The membership in the House of Representatives would be based on a state's population, and they were to be elected by popular vote. So, for example, I looked up the population of the state of Alabama, and we have at this time 4.8 million people. And we have 7 seats in the House of Representatives. And then I was like, let's compare that to New York, okay? So New York has 19.7 million people, and they have 27 seats in the House of Representatives. So that's based on population. And then they established the Senate, where each state has 2 members, regardless of population. These people are also elected by popular vote. We talked about just a second ago that Alabama has fewer seats than New York because of their population, right? Well, in the Senate, New York has 2 senators, Alabama has 2 senators, everybody has 2 senators. So this took portions from the Virginia plan, right, where the House of Representatives is determined by population. And then you have the New Jersey plan where there are 2 votes regardless, right? So this satisfies both groups, and the plan was approved in July of 1787. All right, so here are the actual plans side by side so you can compare. I've put them where you can see the Virginia plan, the New Jersey plan, and then compare the two of them, and then the Great Compromise. So take a look at those in your notes. So they have decided, okay, we are going to determine the House of Representatives by population. So once they had that figured out, they then had to decide who they were going to count in the population. Now, the southern states wanted their slaves to count in their populations because that would greatly boost their population count, and therefore they would have lots of representatives. But that really wasn't fair because obviously the slaves are not going to be voting because remember they are still viewed as property, and the southern states thought that this was unfair. So they are like, we have got to do something about this because this was a problem. So they came up with the 3/5 compromise, and this provided that 3/5 of the enslaved people in a state would be counted toward the state's population. So that means that for every 5 enslaved people, 3 of them would be counted toward the state's population. Oops, I'm so sorry. Um, I forgot to add this section to this PowerPoint. But for the slave trade, this was something that was still going on in the South. And because the slave trade was alive and well in the South, because they still needed slaves to work in the plantations as well as other different businesses and that kind of thing. So this was something that they wanted to discuss as well. So Congress establishes a clause in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, and it prohibits Congress from interfering with the importation of enslaved people until 1808, so 20 years afterwards. In exchange, the delegates agreed that a simple majority in both houses of Congress would regulate commerce. Now, the Electoral College, we are coming up on a presidential election, so this is important for you to understand. So, the president is chosen by the Electoral College, which I will be abbreviating as EC. Now, the EC is made up of people who are from the House of Representatives and the Senate. Now, there are 100 seats in the Senate, and there are 435 seats in the House, so that is 535 votes total. And in order for the president to win the election, he or she must get 270 of those votes. Now, typically, how this works is the representatives from the state of Alabama, for example, will take the popular vote, and let's say that in the last presidential election, for example, the state of Alabama voted in the majority for Donald Trump, the current president. So those representatives would vote for Donald Trump. Okay, so Donald Trump got either 8 or 9 votes from the state of Alabama, right? In the state of California, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. So what California would do, and I'm not sure how many votes off the top of my head that California has, but all of California's votes went to Hillary Clinton. Okay, so what a state does is they will find out how the people vote in the popular vote, and then they generally will vote the same way. Now, remember you have to have 270 votes to win the election in the Electoral College. Now, this has happened before. If there is no majority, then the House of Representatives will choose the president. So there were two groups of people. We're into ratification. There were two groups of people who were concerned about the state of the Constitution. The first would be the Federalists, and they're often called the Nationalists. They supported the Constitution. They were concerned about having a weak government, and they did not want a repeat of the Articles of Confederation. And so they believed that we should have a sufficiently powerful national government that would strengthen the fragile union that we had and would be able to provide and to promote the public good. The Anti-Federalists opposed the Constitution. They believed that a strong government was necessary, but that the Constitution itself betrayed the democratic ideals that they had fought for in the American Revolution. They believed that there should be a government that was more reliant on the states, and so they criticized the Constitution because there was no Bill of Rights, because most state constitutions had a Bill of Rights, and they thought that the U.S. government should have a Bill of Rights as well. So this is a chart comparing the two sides. So if you look at the anti-federalist side, they opposed the Constitution because they were afraid of having a too strong national government. They believed that a republic, a small republic, could protect the rights of people. They drew support from people in the more rural areas, such as small farmers. These were the more common people. They believed that a Bill of Rights was necessary in order to protect individual liberties. And then if you look at the Federalist side, they supported the Constitution. They wanted a strong national government, and they believed that a large republic could best protect an individual's liberties. And they drew support from those who were more wealthy, the large farmers, the merchants, and the artisans. They believed that a Bill of Rights was unnecessary. So there was a group of Federalists, and there were three of them: Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. And they wrote a series of articles in which they defend the Constitution, and they defend the principles that are underlying the Constitution in these essays. They wrote under the pen name Publius in order to honor the Roman Republic, and these were originally published in newspapers in New York City and in the state of New York. Today, we gather the articles together and we call them essays, and we collectively call them the Federalist Papers. Now, the Anti-Federalists wrote their own essays in which they described their chief concern, which was liberty. We will be looking at the Federalist Papers in the coming week or two, so that we can actually study what these men have to say about the Constitution. Now, the ratification process was not easy, and it took some time. It took because the Constitution was officially finished in 1787, and it would not be until the end of 1789 that it was every state had ratified. So this was a couple year long process. It was not until they promised a Bill of Rights that a lot of states would ratify the Constitution. They decided that it would need a majority of 9 states to ratify the Constitution and for it to become effective. So the 9th state ratified the Constitution in June of 1788, and the Constitution officially became the government in the United States. It was the end of 1789 before all 13 states ended up ratifying. All the states ended up doing that, but it took some time because the states had to vote among their legislatures. In September of 1789, Congress proposes 12 amendments to the Constitution, and by 1791, they have ratified 10 of those amendments, and the first 10 amendments to the Constitution are called the Bill of Rights. So, let's take a look at this map real quick. So this is the map, and it shows you each date on here. I know it's hard for you to see, but in each state, like New York, for example, they ratified in July 1788. So it shows you the state of, or the date of each state's ratification. It also shows you which ones were more Federalist and which ones were more anti-Federalist. So the purple is Federalist. Places like Georgia, which is actually a little bit surprising because those were smaller, more rural areas. So Georgia is completely Federalist. the area they voted anyway. Whereas North Carolina and a significant portion of Virginia, as well as the Kentucky district, which is part of Virginia, by the way, um, they are anti-federalist. And there's a giant section of New York that is not is anti-federalist. So it's interesting to see. Um, Somebody in one of my classes in person suggested that it was federalist in places where there were a lot of cities, and he was correct. Places where the large cities were a gracious plenty were federalist. So it's interesting to take a look at that and to see when they were ratified. This is the Bill of Rights. These are the amendments to the Constitution, and these will be on your test in some capacity, so make sure you study those. You have the First Amendment. That's the one that everybody knows off the top of their head, right? Where you have the Freedoms Amendment, where you have the freedom of speech, religion, press, and the right to assembly and to petition. Somebody else mentioned the other day, you have the right to a fair and speedy trial. That's Amendment 6. Um, Number 8 prohibits excessive bail and fines. And if you have taken a look at the English Bill of Rights, that's one that we got from them. And the Amendment 10 is important because it grants to the states and to the people powers that are not listed in the Constitution. So that is what is referred to as the States' Rights Amendment. And that is all of our presentation. Um, I hope that this has been very helpful for you as you are studying for your test, which we will have in the next week or two. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I hope that this has been helpful.